Hello, I'm Michelle Gaida, the CEO of the Kroc Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue. As the leader of the new category of tech diplomacy, the Institute combines world-class technology expertise, Silicon Valley strategies, and foreign policy tools to accelerate the innovation and adoption of trusted technology and ensure that technology advances freedom. Today, the Kroc Institute is honored to host a timely discussion about the role of technology in the contest between freedom and authoritarianism, featuring our chairman, Keith Kroc, and the Republican and Democratic leaders of the Bipartisan Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. That is Chairman Mike Gallagher and Ranking Member Raja Krishnamoorthi. Congressman Gallagher represents Wisconsin's 8th District, and in addition to leading the China Select Committee, serves as chairman of the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Cyber, Information Technologies, and Innovation, and on the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. For 7 years, Congressman Gallagher served on active duty in the Marine Corps, including 2 deployments to Iraq. And in case you're not impressed yet, he's earned a bachelor's degree from Princeton, a master's degree in security studies from Georgetown, a second in strategic intelligence from National Intelligence University, and a PhD in international relations from Georgetown. Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi represents Illinois' 8th District. As a ranking member of the Select Committee, he has the distinction of being the first South Asian American in history to hold such a leadership role in a congressional committee. Congressman Krishnamoorthi also serves on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the Committee on Oversight and Accountability. He graduated summa cum laude from Princeton University with a degree in mechanical engineering and with honors from Harvard Law School. We are thankful for the Congressman's role as an honorary co-chair of the Global Tech Security Commission, led by the former president of Estonia, Kirsti Kaljulaid, and our chairman and today's moderator, Keith Kroc. Chairman Kroc is best known for bringing transformational leadership to multiple sectors, including robotics, engineering software, e-commerce, higher education, philanthropy, economic statecraft, and even the way people sign documents. He recently served as the Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment. As America's top economic diplomat, he became the highest-ranking State Department official to visit Taiwan in 41 years and brokered the $12 billion deal that brought Taiwan's chip giant, TSMC, to the United States. During his tenure, he and his team built the Clean Network Alliance of Democracies, which defeated the CCP's master plan to control global 5G communications. Prior to his public service, Kroc was the chairman and CEO of DocuSign and Ariba. Once again, thank you for joining us for today's special event. Chairman Kroc, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome to Chairman Gallagher and Ranking Member Krishnamoorthi. We're honored to have both of you here. So let's start off with a question for both of you. You know, there's a broad consensus in Washington about the seriousness of the threat to our national security from the Chinese Communist Party. And it's probably the most unifying issue on Capitol Hill. And the Bipartisan China Select Committee is a reflection of that. So let me just, first question, as the chairman and the ranking member of the committee, how important is it to have this united approach when it comes to this issue?
Well, first of all, thank you for doing this, and thank you for your leadership, Keith. You were talking about this long before I think the conventional view shifted in DC. So we're indebted to you for your leadership, and the fact that you've continued it since leaving government is essential. I think while nobody is going to agree on everything, particularly in Congress. Within the parties, people don't agree. Between the parties, people don't agree. I think wherever possible, it's important we lay the future of our foreign policy on a bipartisan foundation. And that's why I'm very fortunate to be able to work with Raja. I know he sees the threat clearly. And I think when it comes to developing a coherent, comprehensive strategy in terms of how we approach this military competition, economic statecraft, ideological competition, if we are united, if Republicans and Democrats can come together and say, this is the direction we want to go to defend our sovereignty from CCP aggression, I think it puts us in a far better position. And I know the one thing the CCP fears more than anything else, and Raja has been particularly outspoken on this point, is Republicans and Democrats willing to work together. In fact, I think they have a deliberate strategy designed to divide Americans against Americans. That America Against America was the title of Wang Huning's book back in the mid 90s. And he's now, a member of the Politburo and perhaps the most powerful person in the CCP besides Xi Jinping himself.
Boy, I couldn't agree more. Nothing terrifies General Secretary Xi more than a United States. Raja, what about you from your perspective?
Well, thanks again for your leadership, Keith, and it's great to be with my chairman here. I think that Xi Jinping has a fear of Packers and Bears fans uniting against this perceived struggle with the CCP. But in all seriousness, I think that, as Mike said, the CCP thinks that disagreement in the United States is somehow a bug in our operating system, that when we disagree with our government, when we disagree with each other, when we debate openly different issues, that something is wrong. But actually, that is our operating system. It's a feature. It's the defining feature, which is our freedom to think, our freedom to debate, our freedom to speak openly about our thoughts, but in support of a common principle. And the principle is guarding and preserving our freedom, our national interests, our values. And I think there's a common concern now in Washington, D.C., not some groupthink. It's not some fake kind of united front, but rather a real serious and profound concern that the CCP is trying to change the world order in a way that is kind of harmful to the principles of freedom, free enterprise, democracy, and so forth.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. When you look at the CCP, they're playing the long game. They're playing for keeps. A four-dimensional game of diplomatic, military, cultural, and economic chess. But technology is at the crossroad of that, and it's really turned out to be the main battleground. And that's why our North Star at the Kroc Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue is technology must advance freedom. And what we see is, the CCP weaponizing that. And, to get back to those democratic values, we talk about the importance of trusted technology, and that technology honors things that you were talking about, our democratic values: respect for rule of law, respect for property, respect for sovereignty of nations, respect for the environment, respect for human rights. Those are things that we honor in the U.S. and in the free world, but China and authoritarian regimes do not. As a matter of fact, they use that against us for their strategic advantage. And that was one of the reasons why our team developed the trust doctrine that we used in terms of building the Clean Network Alliance of Democracies. So I'd be interested, Mike, in your view of trusted tech and how important that is.
Well, I think the trust doctrine that you've developed is still the best intellectual framework for allowing us to think about this. And the Clean Network Alliance of Democracies, I think, gets at a fundamental point, which is that, it can't just be America alone, that one of our unique advantages in this space is our network of allies and partners. And if we harness that, and if we bring our allies and partners along in terms of standards that we set, in terms of pooling our resources, human and technological, really, it's going to be hard for the CCP to beat us over the long term. I think about this kind of in two ways. One is that, for moral reasons or human rights reasons, we don't want to allow our technology to be used by the CCP for, let's say, surveillance in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region and abetting a genocide, or to advance their military to a point where they could take Taiwan by force or potentially kill Americans in a future conflict. And also, in the second sense, we don't want to allow the CCP to control the commanding heights of technology, because we have reams of evidence to suggest they will use that for coercive purposes, to silence speech, not just within China's borders, but around the world. And that's really, I think, our concern when it comes to technology. It's why we need to have aggressive and smart export controls. I think there's a lot more we can do that. I think we can end some licensing exemptions for things like Huawei. And again, I think it goes back to the intellectual framework that you laid out when you were in the administration.
Well, I appreciate that. It was interesting because when I came into government, from the private sector, the first thing I did is I had about 60 bilateral meetings with my foreign counterparts, the finance ministers, economic ministers, foreign ministers. And, I'd ask them, I'd say, hey, how's your relationship with China? And they'd say, well, they're a very important trading partner. Then it seemed like almost every time they looked like both ways, like there was somebody in the room, and they lean in and they whisper, but we don't trust them. And that, that rang bells in my head because that's the most important word in any language. And that's their biggest weakness. And so if you look at the trust doctrine, it really turned the tables on what I call their power principle of intimidation, coercion, retribution. So we, in essence, weaponize the very principles that protect our freedom. I think that was the magic behind that. And so now we're continuing that. And I want to thank you, Raja, for serving on the Global Tech Security Commission as an honorary co-chair, along with more than a dozen of your bipartisan colleagues. And the charter of that is to develop and operationalize a global tech security strategy, offensive and defensive strategies, as well as force multipliers. We've got some 50 commissioners, it's unique because it's an international commission. We're doing it with 15 of our closest technological allies. So let me ask you this, Roger. What do you see as some of the key elements of that strategy? And also, what are the key insights do lawmakers need from the commission to ensure that tomorrow's technology advances freedom?
Well, let me piggyback off of something that Mike said, which is I think that one of the things that we have to recognize is working with our allies, friends, partners, and others, we have to create global standards that are consistent with our values.
Right.
So, for instance, we're going to have 6G around the corner now that the 5G, kind of stage of development is underway or being completed. And, Huawei and others helped to define what 5G looked like. And unfortunately, a lot of countries ended up buying 5G equipment, which, the CCP has a back door into, and that can help with their surveillance and then help others with theirs. And so we have to create a new set of standards for 6G where we basically say, look, you're going to have to abide by certain principles if you are going to be a trusted partner in 6G. So, for instance, you're not going to provide back doors to the CCP or other intelligence agencies so that they can then further their espionage programs. You are not going to allow it to be used for techno surveillance or repression of your own people. We're going to make it open source so that more vendors can participate. Also, with AI, we're all concerned about artificial intelligence and what are the principles that are going to be baked into AI to make sure that we know that the algorithms are transparent, that the data that has been fed into those algorithms, there's some privacy protections associated with them, that they aren't just being utilized in ways to, again, surveil the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region and so forth. And then finally, that AI is not going to be used for our own extinction unwittingly. Where robots are allowed to use lethal force without any human intervention and so forth. So anyway, those are some of the thoughts that are just top of mind.
That is a major strategic imperative for the Global Tech Security Commission is developing those tech trust standards. And we're actually right now designing a certification center. And the chairman for that on the commission is actually the Audrey Tong, the Minister of Digital Affairs from Taiwan. And she's probably one of the most foremost experts in this area. And it's all about defining an overarching standard that that includes all those democratic values. And so, on the subject of Taiwan, Mike, I just got back from Taiwan, where we announced Taiwan Center for Innovation and Prosperity at the Kroc Institute. I also presented President Tsai with the Tech Freedom Award. And Taiwan obviously is so critical in the semiconductor arena. When I was in government, serving as undersecretary, one of our missions was to secure the semiconductor supply chain. And in 2020, there was not one semiconductor company in the world that was going to build any manufacturing capacity in the United States. And we talked to the CEO, Intel, Samsung, Micron, and we figured if we could get TSMC to onshore, that would serve as a catalyst to get the rest of the semiconductor manufacturer. And indeed, that happened when we onshored TSMC. We made it happen 2 weeks' time. $12 billion onshoring, largest in history. And since then, $350 billion of semiconductor investment and jobs have now come into the U.S. So Taiwan's been a really, really a key partner. Let me ask you this. One of the big things we push for was a free trade agreement, which we think is strategic, because when America does a free trade agreement, that's a signal to the private sector to come in and invest, and then our allies come in and invest. So from a security standpoint, we want a lot of our allies to be invested in Taiwan. What do you think of a free trade agreement? And then also, in your view, what is, talk about how important Taiwan is to our national security, and what are some of the things we can do to deter PRC's aggression?
Well, I am emphatically in favor of a free trade agreement with Taiwan. Right now, we have, the 21st century trade agreement. The problem with that, in my opinion, is that it doesn't involve the real meat and potatoes. Market access is the biggest one. I know it's not easy to tackle that, but I think particularly in light of what I think is the skepticism in both parties right now over big multilateral agreements, all the more reason why we need to be looking for strategic bilateral FTAs. Taiwan. The other thing that has always been on my list for the last 4 years has been a gold standard trade agreement post-Brexit with the UK, and it can have really high standards, and I don't think it would threaten industries in America. Short of that, the one thing that our friends in Taiwan talked about when I was last there was the double taxation issue. You can get an agreement on double taxation, which would be huge, particularly if we're trying to expand semiconductor manufacturing in the United States. It would actually help us in that regard. That to me is just low-hanging fruit right there. Zooming back out and to the second part of your question on Taiwan's overall importance, I think about this, one, in the economic sense of even in the best case scenario for, let's say, CHIPS Act implementation, where there's a renaissance of domestic fabs, TSMC is still going to be a massively important player for the global economy. And it's not like we can afford to ignore Taiwan. And we can't allow the CCP to have the coercive economic power that would come from control of semiconductor manufacturing. Two, I think if Taiwan were to fall, it would make our ability to fulfill our treaty commitments in the region unsustainable, particularly with Japan and the Philippines. And I think we would be naive to think that the CCP threat would be confined to the first island chain. I think it would just grow regionally and ultimately globally. And then finally, I would say, notwithstanding the debate and at times controversial debate that we've had in America for the last 2 decades about war in general and the purpose of war and so-called forever wars, there's something in my mind fundamentally different between sort of promoting a democratization agenda, which some people are skeptical of after Iraq and Afghanistan, and defending an existing, highly functional, highly vibrant democracy from an authoritarian threat. And if America doesn't stand for that latter thing, I'm not sure what we stand for. And Taiwan is sort of a beacon of democracy and freedom that it's increasingly in the shadow of this big totalitarian threat. And so I think for those three reasons and many more, it is in our interest to help Taiwan defend itself and make sure we have a robust military posture in the region that deters Xi Jinping from launching an invasion of Taiwan.
I couldn't agree with you more. Taiwan is the linchpin of democracy. They're a role model of freedom for not just the region, but around the world. So, well, thank you for that. Raja, I've got a question for you with regard to TikTok. There in Billings, Montana, a reporter spotted, their Chinese spy balloon. And that sighting led the state of Montana to examine the vulnerability to Chinese technology. And it resulted in a statewide ban of TikTok, the first of its kind in the nation. I actually testified in their legislative hearing on that law, and I'm really glad they passed it. And now, predictably, TikTok is suing Montana to prevent the law from going into effect in January 2024. We've recently had a fireside chat with Montana's Attorney General talking about that. We're working with other states. How does the China Select Committee, view this threat, and how do you recommend to address it?
Well, thank you, Keith. And as far as the Select Committee, I think there are differences of opinion on this particular issue. But Mike and I actually have a bipartisan bill, and I think it's the only bipartisan bicameral bill that talks about TikTok in the context of, we don't want an adversarial regime controlling certain big tech platforms or social media platforms operating in the U.S. With regard to TikTok, as we know, ByteDance is its parent, and under Chinese law, ByteDance is required to provide access to user data for the 132 million users in America and anyone around the world. But most concerning, ByteDance has a CCP cell embedded within the senior leadership of the company, just like every other private company in China, and therefore its algorithm is basically subject to control by the CCP. Now, I understand the concerns with regard to legislation on TikTok. I would like to see it not go dark, but actually have the company sold to another entity that is not controlled by the CCP. And if you ask my constituents, I suspect the same is true with Mike and others. If you ask constituents, would you rather have TikTok controlled by the CCP or TikTok controlled by some other, more, I guess, non-adversarial regime? They obviously would opt for the latter. And that's kind of what I would like to see happen. As far as what legislation is going to actually take place, surprise, surprise, there are different committees of jurisdiction on this, and they have differences of opinion. The White House would like to see Congress act so that they have more authorities in this situation, because CFIUS is broken for all practical purposes, and they don't have the bargaining power that they need to get ByteDance to do what it should do. And so that's kind of where I see it right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. If China can weaponize a balloon, think what they could do with 132 million Americans at their mercy. I've got 11-year-old twins. I won't let them near TikTok. It's disguised as candy, but it's really cocaine. I also, the other thing too is, so let's say, hey, you don't care if CCP sees your data. Well, it can see the data of everybody you digitally interact with, your friends, your family, your business colleagues. In that sense, it's a digital virus, and I really do believe, the only vaccine for that is a ban, and maybe an acquisition by another company, but that's pretty tough to do. But I'm glad you see it that way. So let me ask you this, Mike. One of the things you did as chairman of the China Select Committee is you looked at the real and urgent threat on college campuses. I sent a letter to all the boards of governors and trustees back when I was an undersecretary talking about the Chinese threat in terms of ensuring academic freedom, honoring human dignity, safeguarding intellectual property, and protecting university endowments. And we created kind of a divestment movement with the Athena Group in terms of, and it's young Republicans and the equivalent young Democrats on college campuses for divestment of these Chinese malign companies. What would you see as a way to address this issue, and what should universities do?
Well, I do believe that we need to shut down Confucius Institutes on campuses, particularly if those institutes receive funding from the U.S. government for research. So, for example, earlier this year, I wrote to the president of Alfred University, which received a $13.5 million grant to conduct advanced hypersonic weapons-related research while actively partnering with a Chinese university that performs similar research for the PLA. Now, the president wrote back within 2 weeks and promised to close his campus's Confucius Institute, but the action was only taken after we brought the matter to his attention on behalf of the committee. And from October 1st of this year, any schools that allow Confucius Institutes to operate will risk losing Department of Defense funding. And already more than 108 schools have closed their Confucius Institutes, representing nearly 90% of the total. That's a good first step. More needs to be done. We've seen sometimes these universities just kind of rename the institute and they're able to sidestep the intent of the law. The other thing I think we need to do is just enforce provisions that are already in the Higher Education Act, such as requiring the disclosure of donations in excess of $250,000, which often is not disclosed. A lot of that money is coming from China. But then on the positive side, I do think we need to highlight universities that are tackling these very complicated issues well. I know of your involvement with Purdue, for example. I was very impressed when I met with President Meng Chang in Purdue when I was there, and I think they've done a lot and have really led in this space. And so where we have sort of pockets of excellence, I think we can promote those and highlight those so we don't just have a punitive strategy going forward.
Right. I think it's really critical to have those kind of universities that serve as that role model. And I think that's one of the reasons why Purdue's become probably the top national security university in the United States outside the military academies, because our focus on that. And when you're, we're conducting cutting edge research in all the national tech security sectors, it's critical. And it's critical to protect that intellectual property. And I think it's also critical to put your money where your mouth is and not have those endowments invested in those Chinese companies. And so, Raja, that leads to, this whole area of the Uyghurs and the surveillance state in Xinjiang. And the CCP is committing punishable genocide, and there's more than 1 million civilians in concentration camps over there, and they're using that slave labor throughout supply chains. And my good friend Nuri Turkel, who was born there in one of those concentration camps, and whose mother's still there, testified about those horrors before your committee. And Congress has taken great action. It passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which bans the import from China made with slave labor. That's a great start. Key thing is, how do we get companies to audit those supply chains, and what kind of things do you think we can do to end that Uyghur genocide?
Well, you're absolutely right, Keith, and thanks for shining a light on this issue. And Nuri did testify before us, along with 2 women, by the way, who were victimized by this genocide. And I think it's fair to say, I think Mike would agree with me, those were some of the most chilling moments that we've witnessed. For me, in Congress, I mean, you couldn't hear a pin drop, or you could hear a pin drop. It was so silent. Um, I think what we have to do is we have to enact measures tightening enforcement of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. We've started looking at this in the committee, and Mike can speak about this as well. But there's something called the de minimis exception, which allows a lot of companies, especially these fast fashion companies like Shein and Temu and others, to base their business model on being able to ship items less than $800 in value in allotments that don't really face the scrutiny that bigger shipments do by the Customs and Border Patrol. So a lot of products we suspect that were involving forced labor in Xinjiang are shipped that way and escape any scrutiny by our authorities. The other thing I just mentioned is Mike and I are going to New York City this weekend, not to see a Broadway show, although Mike, if we have time, let me know. But we're going to be having a field hearing to talk about investments by Wall Street firms and others in Chinese companies that are doing bad things, including participating in the Uyghur genocide. Unfortunately, on the one hand, we prohibit the importation of goods from a lot of companies that engage in forced labor. But on the other hand, we allow for investments in those same companies. I don't get it. And so that's something that's going to come up in our discussions in New York City. I know it's a little bit of an uncomfortable subject for some folks, but it's something that we have to talk about, because if we're really serious about this, then those same companies should face other types of sanctions, including outbound restrictions with regard to capital going into those companies. I apologize. I have to jump off, but I just wanted to mention that.
Well, thank you, Raja. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your great service to the country and everything you're doing on this issue. And it's so great to see such a strong united front on this with you and Mike. So, Raja, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey, Mike, let me ask you a follow-up question to that. Because the Institute developed with Wharton Business School, it's been taught there several times, a case study. And it was about solar energy and ESG. The protagonist is the Clean Capital Markets campaign that we put together when I was undersecretary. The antagonist was the CEO of BlackRock. The case study walks through the solar industry, where industry experts predict that by 2050, 60% of the world's energy will come from solar. And as you know, China controls that, and they manufacture all these solar panels in Xinjiang with the two biggest coal-fired power plants in the world, and with slave labor. And it walks through this whole area of ESG, and it leaves the student with the question, should any Chinese companies be considered ESG? For three reasons: E, S, and G. Because they're the biggest polluter. That's the E, environmental. Is social. Well, these guys are committing genocide and they're enabling surveillance state. So it's all about human rights. And G, governance. And the number one thing there is the fiduciary duties. And you can't audit these guys' books, and they do all kinds of things cooking the book. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I can't say it any better than you just did. And it seems to me that a lot of times the most ardent ESG evangelists on Wall Street are the very same people that are most willing to turn a blind eye to the atrocities that are happening in Xinjiang, as well as just the general aggression from the Chinese Communist Party. And you're right, when it comes to the E, the S, and the G, China has a terrible track record, and the G should stand for genocide, if it stands for anything. So for those who want to invest their money in an ESG fund, presumably they don't want their money going to fund an ongoing genocide against a religious and ethnic minority, right? Or their money going to fund the Chinese military. That part isn't hard. I mean, funds that purport to take on the moral high ground should not also fund the CCP's environmental destruction, its surveillance state, or it's genocide. And I wonder if we have an opportunity to tackle part of this issue when it comes to university endowments, because we've actually had a lot of students step up in recent months and demand more transparency. And obviously the younger generation is very animated by this issue of environmental protection. And just as a matter of, I mean, again, if you care about the environment, why would you invest your money into China? And so that's why I think we should, hopefully on the committee, we'll be engaging with those who manage university endowments as to how they think about this issue, their overall exposure to China. The final thing I would say is, if you just take off the environmental lens or the moral lens and do a pure sort of business profit analysis, I just think the risks of investing in China are piling up. And the risks range from the risks of having your assets seized in the event of a Taiwan crisis to the risks inherent in things like variable interest entities, for which there's no shareholder protection. So as a business proposition, it doesn't look good. And if you look at certain funds like BlackRock's FXI ETF, it's down, I want to say, 30% over the last 5 years. At the same time, the S&P 500 is soared by 70 or 80%, even as China's GDP has doubled or tripled. It doesn't really make any sense.
Right. By the way, you're so right. And you know what? It's the average American citizen. It has been unknowingly financing, the military buildup, the surveillance state, these environmental practices. And it was interesting when we dug into it, and when we were developing our clean capital markets campaign. China's seen this issue coming a long time. So what they did is they broke all of these maligned Chinese companies into an unnatural amount of subsidiaries. You'd never see it in the real world, just because there's so much overhead legal account. They put a lot of them in the Cayman Islands. Then they seduce with money, MSCI, Emerging Fund Index, the FTSE, and then all that goes into BlackRock's 431 emerging market funds, and then that gets buried in the 11.7 trillion U.S. pension funds. And that was one of the things that we really wanted to push for. Was the Secretary of Labor has 2/3 of the authority for ERISA, and a responsibility called the prudent man rule. We wanted the Secretary of Labor to issue a business advisory to all pension fund managers about this risk, because it's pretty tough to find these Chinese companies in your pension fund or in your in your wealth account. And what do you think about that? Is there something we can do there?
Well, again, I agree. We're agreeing too much on this. It's because all I'm doing is following the lead that you laid out when you were in government and claiming credit for it. But you think about how perverse that is, right? If you make the health of tens of millions of American retirees, their financial health in their later years, dependent in some meaningful sense on the success of the Chinese Communist Party, and the success of the Chinese Communist Party means genocide. It means not only regional dominance for them, but I think global dominance is their ultimate ambition. It means the silencing of free expression and free speech globally. It means the retreat of American values and American leadership. If you link that to the health of Americans' finances in their later years, you're creating a bizarre, perverse set of incentives. And so it's why we launched this bipartisan investigation of MSCI and BlackRock. And I get it. These are complex issues. I get that we are so economically and financially entangled with China that in my opinion, that's what makes this new Cold War far more complex than the old, because we never had to contemplate decoupling from the Soviet Union. And what the heck do I know as a dumb Marine about the world of high finance? But I do believe that on the basic things, like just Chinese military companies, your average American, your average Wisconsinite here in Northeast Wisconsin does not want their retirement money funding Chinese military companies.
Right.
Companies that are building things designed to kill Americans in a future war. So there are areas where I think we can decouple in a smart, strategic way.
Yeah. And it's so important for these companies to disclose. And there's a lot that we can do there. And the other thing, too, is it gives a huge advantage to these Chinese companies to access the most efficient capital markets in the world, and that's the United States. And I took 3 companies public, and these guys don't have to do Sarbanes-Oxley. They don't have to follow GAAP accounting methods when they're on one of the American exchanges, and we don't want to sacrifice that gold standard that we have. So there's a number of issues behind this. Let me ask you this: you're talking about the former Soviet Union, and with Putin's bloody invasion of the Ukraine, more than 1,000 companies frantically withdrew their business from Russia, hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, like you pointed out, if you compare that to China, and they need to do that, this is 10 to 30 times greater than what they had to do with Russia. And I think I penned an article in Fortune about a year ago that said, present your China contingency plan at the next board meeting, because of the risk of Xi cracking down on the private sector in China, hostilities in Taiwan, the real estate, all those different risks, and a board member's fiduciary duty to his shareholders is to mitigate risk. So now one of the things that we're doing, really because of request out of this article, is issuing a corporate board advisory on China risk mitigation planning. And we got a lot of requests for, hey, what does a China contingency plan look like? Do you have a checklist? So we're about ready to publish all those things. They're just coming out. So what do you think about this approach, and what role do you think Congress should play in helping shareholders and federal employees and our military retirees make sure they get the information, out, from this outside risk? And also, what kind of pressure can we apply to corporate boards to say, hey, you need a China risk mitigation plan?
Yeah. Well, one observation related to your point and your great op-ed about Ukraine. If you think about it, after the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, we were then left scrambling, trying to come up with a sanctions regime in response to that invasion. And remarkably, even though we learned the lesson that we should have had that planned prior to an invasion, should have had that contingency plan, we didn't have one ready to go when the second invasion happened more recently. And it's my observation, after we ran a war game with the Select Committee on a Taiwan Strait contingency, that similarly we just have no, here's our financial and economic escalation ladder that's already ready to go, that we've already socialized with our allies so that we don't have to make it up after the fact. And oh, by the way, even if we are committed to a policy of strategic ambiguity on our military response, I think it would be wise to have clarity when it comes to our economic and financial response, i.e., Xi, make no mistake, if you do this, at a minimum, we are going to impose severe economic and financial costs, to say nothing of the military response.
Right.
But we don't have that. So one of the recommendations that came out of the committee's work was to develop that. We endorsed a bill of mine that I have with Dan Sullivan in the Senate on forcing us to think through the financial and economic escalation prior to an invasion, in the pursuit of deterring an invasion in the first place. To get to the broader aspects of your question, I do think we need to enforce greater standards of transparency and disclosure around U.S. investment in Chinese companies. And yes, I do think Congress should drive the issue. I don't think we should just rely solely on one administration's interpretation of the DOL's authority, because that can obviously be reversed by a different administration. I've co-sponsored a bill that would do just that for retirement plans that are governed by ERISA. And I think we now need to go further and require those companies and deep investors, those companies investors with deep ties to China, to disclose their practices publicly, because transparency and freedom of information are the backbone of our financial system. One further idea would be to require or ask the Fed to model the consequences of a PLA invasion of Taiwan and what that would do to the global economy. And I think that would help people more accurately assess the risks of doing business in China.
Yeah, by the way, and how. And, the results would be devastating, right, to the economy. Catastrophic, high tech, obviously. But there's nothing like war gaming it out and seeing the numbers for itself. That does a lot to crystallize a lot of things in people's minds, and it gives a great concrete argument for that. We were saying General Secretary Xi's biggest fear is United States. Maybe one thing more than that, and that is a united set of allies. And I think when we're modeling these things out, it's all about getting not just our allies, but our private sector. When I was in my Senate confirmation hearing, Senator Coons asked me what my strategy would be for combating authoritarian aggression, economic authoritarian aggression. I said, look, I would harness U.S.'s three biggest areas of competitive advantage by strengthening and unifying our allies and our partnerships, those relationships. The second would be to leverage the innovation and resources of the private sector. This is something we have. China doesn't really. And then third, of course, is amplifying the moral high ground of democratic trust principles. And so this whole area of bringing in our allies is key. So let me ask you this, and this kind of picks up on the notion that economic security is national security. And, the CCP's playbook is all about seducing with money and reinforcing that with intimidation and retaliation. And in those 60 bilateral meetings that I had with my foreign counterparts, the elephant in the room always was that intimidation and retaliation. And their strategy is to pick off the weak gazelle from the herd and go after it. And so that's a big reason why we built that Clean Network Alliance of Democracies, because it created a security blanket. There's strength in numbers. There's power in unity and solidarity. And, we really believe that the ultimate would be an economic NATO with its own economic version of Article 5 that would really shield countries from China's bullying, because the way WTO rules are right now, if China retaliates against Australia, we can't necessarily go back and retaliate against them for that reason. So when we put together the Clean Network, that represented 2/3 of the world's global GDP. So there's real power in that. And so I'm just wondering, what do you think about an economic NATO approach? And what are some of the things, if you think it's a good idea, what are some of the things Congress can do to be a catalyst for that?
Well, I think we absolutely need a robust counter-coercion framework or a playbook with our closest allies, particularly in the region. And honestly, the concentric circle can expand beyond our closest allies like Australia and Japan to include countries that are not allies in the traditional sense, but are vital partners. Then I'm thinking about countries like Vietnam, with whom we have a shared interest in countering CCP coercion. I mean, obviously, the big kahuna is, in terms of non-allied countries, is India. And, I don't think they're going to become a treaty ally anytime soon. But in my opinion, there's no coherent long-term economic strategy against China that doesn't include a closer partnership with India. And not just economic, but on the military front as well. And as we seek to disentangle ourselves from our economic exposure to China, India is an obvious logical destination for more manufacturing and intensified economic coercion. Here, I'll give an attaboy to Ambassador Emmanuel in Japan, and a lot of what he's been talking about in terms of countering economic coercion and a counter coercion strategy. I mean, right now we're seeing China go after Japan, waging economic warfare against Japan on this issue related to, the health of fisheries and nuclear disposing of nuclear waste. It's absurd, and I think this is an opportunity where we can come to the defense of Japan. And if we have that playbook you talk about worked out in advance, we don't need to make it up on the fly, and we can be very quick and nimble in our response and make sure that China doesn't get away with it, because obviously they're just trying to intimidate us. And then you have a whole category of countries that we just need to compete for influence, countries where we haven't shown up. I mean, I'm thinking about the Solomon Islands right now, or I'm thinking about countries like Indonesia, which is going to be massively influential over the next 2 decades, where we just need we need to show up. We need to be there. We need to have, it doesn't need to be a huge presence. We need to develop a generation of experts in our own national security community that understand these countries in the way that I was part of a generation of young people that started studying Arabic in the Middle East because, in the Marine Corps I was going to go fight there. We need to do the same for a lot of these countries in Asia where we just don't have a deep reservoir and bench of expertise.
One of the key things, and we really focused on this when we were going around building that 60-country coalition and clean network, is we need a strong value proposition. What these guys want more than anything else is they want investment from the United States private sector, and primarily from the innovation sector. That's what we have to offer, and they'd rather have us. And this is a great way to spread trust in technology. This is one of the initiatives that we're putting together at the Kroc Institute. We call it the Trust in Tech Microfinance Partnership, and that is private sector led. Trusted technology, particularly in rural areas, to close the digital divide. So that value proposition is key. I couldn't agree with you more. All right, let me just ask you one final question. You've been so generous with your time, Mike. The China Select Committee has been operating for 9 months. You've held a number of great hearings on a wide range of threats. Maybe just sum it up by sharing what are some of your observations, what stood out, is there anything there we haven't discussed that you'd like to share with our audience?
First of all, thank you again for everything you've done and for being able to join you. I really enjoyed the discussion. I think, as evidenced by the first half of this discussion with Ranking Member Krishnamoorthi, the most pleasant surprise has been how bipartisan the issue and the work has been thus far. And I give credit to Speaker McCarthy and Minority Leader Jeffries for setting that tone from the start. I mean, they got all of us, all the committee members, into a room early on. And I know it sounds crazy, but that never happens. You never have the speaker and the leader of the Democrats doing something like this. At least I haven't seen it before. And they basically said the same thing, which is that we want, to the extent possible, we want Congress to speak with one voice on this issue. It's too important to be subject to partisan politics. If you want to go on, TV and throw bombs and criticize the other side, there are other committees for that, but this is not that committee. And so that's been a real pleasant surprise. Now, I'm not trying to gloss over some of the differences. Obviously, Republicans and Democrats disagree about things like the relative prioritization of climate change and our strategy on China, the role of federal government funding, as part of our strategy. I got it. I'm not trying to be Pollyanna kumbaya. There are meaningful differences between the parties, but by and large, it's been bipartisan. The other thing I'd say, and I say this as someone who, though not a China expert by any stretch, I spent a lot of time in my 7 years in Congress focusing on this issue, and I thought I really understood it. In this work, I guess I realized much more complex the threat is, and my lens was myopically focused on military competition in the Indo-Pacific, and so to really discover the variety of things that China, or the Chinese Communist Party more precisely, is doing right here at home in America, whether it's illegal police stations in the heart of Manhattan, whether it's harmless sounding nonprofits on American campuses that are being used to harass Taiwanese or Chinese students. Whether it's the theft of seeds in Iowa or, take your pick. I mean, spy balloon is probably a pretty good reminder that this isn't a distant threat. But just, I think for me, it's reminded me that we need to constantly, those of us who focus on national security and foreign policy, need to really connect it to the lives of everyday Americans and make this argument that this isn't a distant over there problem that we can afford to ignore. It's a right here at home problem. It's a matter of our own sovereignty and really a matter of what kind of world do we want to live in going forward. And a world that the Chinese Communist Party dominates would be a very, very dark world for my children, for your children, and future generations.
Mike, I thank you for your service to the Marines. I thank you for your great leadership on the China Select Committee, and I also thank you for your time this morning. It's been great, really insightful. And
well, let me say one. Can I say one more nice thing about you? I've been too nice, but let me say one more. I think there are a lot of people in your position that have had your level of success, Keith. Well, there aren't a lot of people that have had that level, but wouldn't have taken on the mission that you took on. It's not easy to serve in government. It's not easy to go through a confirmation process. It's not easy to navigate the bureaucracy of the State Department or other places, but the country was lucky to have you do that. And the fact that you're continuing it, we need more people, particularly those that have business backgrounds and have had that level of success, to be willing to serve like that. We need to make it easier for people with that level of success to serve. So thank you for doing it. I've learned a lot from your leadership, and I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for joining the special event brought to you by the Kroc Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue. To find out about our work to accelerate the innovation and adoption of trusted technology, please visit the Institute at techdiplomacy.org, find us on all the major social platforms, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter, Tech Diplomacy Now, on Substack, for the latest news at the intersection of high tech and foreign policy. We also welcome you to learn about the Global Tech Security Commission at globaltechsecurity.com. The Commission includes senior multi-sector leaders from the U.S. and our closest technologically advanced allies, working together to develop the definitive global tech security strategy to safeguard high tech from authoritarian threats. Join our mission to ensure that technology advances freedom. Tomorrow's tech must be trusted tech because our freedom is literally at stake. Thanks again, and see you next time.